Chapter 8, Part 2 here. Chapter 8, Part 2. So we stopped here at this. This is, you can consider this, I don't have the words sociology of news written on this slide, but you might just write that in your notes. That's kind of one way that you could organize this, this next set of slides. The sociology of news is an area of the journalism scholarship that is concerned with, again, what is news? That question, what is news? But it looks at it from a different perspective than just those simple 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 news values that we looked at in part 1 of this lesson. They look at, sociology of news scholars look at the constraints that exert themselves. The constraints that exert themselves on news production processes and that ultimately influence the kind of news that you and I see in the newspaper and on TV and in the radio. Okay, they talk about individual level constraints, organizational level constraints, institutional level constraints. So there are different levels of constraints. They work together and they ultimately influence what you and I see in the news every day. Okay, that's kind of the sociology of news perspective. So let's look at some of these constraints. What is the individual level? The individual level of constraints, again, this is a level of constraints that works to ultimately influence the kinds of news decisions that are made at news organizations. And the individual level is all about really the individual journalist. It's the individual values. We all have different values as people. And as Herbert Gans, one of the famous sociology of news scholars, said, you cannot divorce yourself from your values. It's impossible. So you can try all you want to be 100% objective, and it's good to try to strive for that, but there are always values, right? You have to make individual decisions, right? You can't separate yourself from that, even if you're trying to be objective. You have to make certain decisions. Like, you see things happening, you're automatically going to reject some things and latch on to others when you're going about your workday. As a journalist, a source might call you and say, hey, I have a story for you. I think something's happening that you might be interested in. And you go, no, I don't think that's news. Right? That's your personal decision. Another journalist might have accepted that as a story. Or who you decide to talk to. Maybe you have a story idea, but you decide to talk to this person. Another journalist may have decided to talk to somebody else, right? Or the kind of questions that you ask. You ask a certain kind of question, I might ask an entirely different kind of question because we have different backgrounds. So we have different values, different decisions. We have different training levels, different education levels. And all of these things impact what news is covered and how the news is covered, right? This is why you go to the press conference, you've got 100 different journalists, and in many cases you're going to get different stories because those individual journalists have different values, they have different decisions, different kinds of training, education, right? There's also the organizational level of constraints, editorial policies, newsroom routines, the bottom line, the concern about money. They have to make money. News organizations have to make money, right? All of these things influence news-making decisions, right? One of the journalism scholars, Bantz, in 1997, he said that news is like a factory. A newsroom is like a factory. And he says the newsroom production process is like an assembly line where you have story ideation, and it goes from story ideation to task assignment. Okay, you do this and you do this. And then it goes to gathering and structuring the materials, right? Going out and doing the interviews and whatever. And then it goes out to assembling the materials. And then finally you present the newscast or write the news story or whatever. So it's kind of like an assembly line. But it's a little bit different in every news outlet. And the different routines, the different editorial policies can ultimately influence the kinds of things that are produced in the newsrooms. When I did my study in Egypt, I went to Egypt in 2008 and I spent time at different newspapers. I found that some newspapers had different routines than others. And I absolutely found that it affected the way in which news stories were written and produced. So just to give you an example, at one newspaper, they didn't have computers. It was very poor, and everything was handwritten. But the fact that everything was handwritten, it really cut into time. Like they didn't have as much time. So those folks didn't spend a lot of time in the field. They would sit back and call sources on the phone. Another newspaper, they had laptops and they had a network and everything, and so they could spend more time in the field. They could spend more time gathering and structuring materials. So it affected the newsroom, the news products. Another difference that I found was that some newspapers had their own printing presses, so they could have a late deadline. Other newspapers did not have their own printing presses, so they had to send everything out to get printed at other places, and so they had to have a really early deadline. One of the newspapers that I studied, they had a 2:30 p.m. deadline for news that's going to come out the next day. So that's a very early deadline, right? So, anyways, those are just some examples. Organizational level constraints. Think about editorial policy of Fox News and the editorial policy of MSNBC. Very different, right? That affects things. Institutional level constraints. You have national ideology. It's always at play. We have ideologies in this country. Democracy is good. That is an ideology. Capitalism is good. That is part of our ideology. That's not necessarily believed everywhere in the world, right? But the national ideology not only affects how journalists approach their work, but it affects how all of us think about things, right? It structures the way we think about stuff. The national ideology, the culture, the law, the legal framework, right? Think about this. You cannot act outside the bounds of your culture. It's impossible. And if you were to do that, you would be immediately reprimanded for having committed some kind of cultural sacrilege. Kent McDougal was a socialist who worked at the Wall Street Journal. And he kept it hidden. He concealed it for years and years and years. And then he retired and he said, hey, guess what? I was a socialist. And the first thing that news scholars did was they went back and studied Kent McDougal's stories. And do you know what they found? Nothing. They found that there was no real difference between what he had written and what other people had written. Because he could not, even though he was trying to, he could not go beyond the culturally accepted bounds of a capitalist culture, right? So even if he knew that he couldn't say certain things, so he didn't. And when he did try to say certain things, his editor would stop it. His editor would say, that word, I don't like that word. I'm going to change it to this word, right? So anyways, you can't go beyond the bounds of your culture. At least it's very difficult to do that. Hegemony becomes very important. Hegemony is the dominance of certain ideas over others. When ideas become hegemonic, they become a part of the, quote, taken for granted terrain, to borrow a phrase from Stuart Hall. The taken for granted terrain. When things are taken for granted, we just take it for granted that capitalism's good, that democracy's good. It's a part of the common sense. So those ideas are hegemonic in our society. You cannot act in a way that is counter-hegemonic. I mean, you can, but it's extremely difficult. And in the news business, it's almost impossible to get ideas, counter-hegemonic ideas out there, right? So individual level constraints, organizational level constraints, institutional level constraints. All of these things work together to sort of structure the news and influence the kinds of news products that you and I see. We have to ask this question. Is it possible to be objective? Well, I'll let you read this quote on your own. I think it's a really powerful quote. But I think we can suffice in saying that it's good. Objectivity is a good goal. It's very reasonable because we want to try to be fair and balanced, but it's probably not realistic to expect people to be 100% objective. It's probably not possible for the reasons that we talked about earlier, that you can't divorce yourself from your values. But that does not change the fact that you should strive for objectivity as a journalist. Think about it as an unattainable goal. But it's still a goal. We try to get as close as we can, but we can't necessarily get there. Okay? Now, one of the models that I think is very interesting of the U.S. press is this model presented by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky in their book Manufacturing Consent, which was originally published in 1988 and then republished in 2002, called the propaganda model. Right? The model is called the propaganda model. The book is called Manufacturing Consent. But they present the propaganda model of the American mass media. Study this, think about it, and determine whether or not you agree. But what they say is that there are a set of filters that govern what Americans see in the news. So you know what a filter is, right? You think about a water filter. What does a water filter do? It basically filters out all of the stuff that is not fit to drink. Well, a filter on a news system basically filters out all of the stuff that's not fit to print. Okay? So we only see certain things. Other stuff gets filtered out. What are the filters? There are 5 of them, according to Herman and Chomsky. There is the concentration of ownership. So the first filter is the fact that only a few people own the news. Right? So we're only getting a few ideas to begin with being mentioned. A lot of ideas fall by the wayside because people that have those ideas they're not powerful. They don't own news outlets, right? The second filter is advertising. They say that advertising influences the news, directly and indirectly. Sometimes directly, like when advertisers call up a newspaper and say, hey, don't think about running that story that's critical of my company. Otherwise, we're going to pull our advertisements. And that does happen from time to time, okay? But also just sometimes indirectly where newspapers, news organizations sort of defer. They sort of take it light on their advertisers because you can't bite the hand that feeds you. Remember, in the news, they make most of their money from advertising, right? So that's another filter. The third filter they talk about is sourcing. It's very interesting. When you become a journalist, you develop a stable of sources. You keep going back to those sources. Over time, a symbiotic relationship develops. A mutually beneficial relationship develops. You need the sources for your news, and they need you because they want to get their thoughts, their ideas in the press. And so what happens is the relationships get real cozy and the journalists stop being overly critical of the sources. That's one problem, right? The other problem is that the sources are usually elites, right? This is why Sam Donaldson, formerly of ABC News, he said that at the end of the day, he was just being honest. He's like, at the end of the day, we usually end up with a story that the White House has suggested, that sources at the White House have suggested for us. Because they're important sources. If the White House calls a press conference or releases a statement or whatever, that's going to be in the news. They're important sources. So the sources in the news are elite. If they do all these interesting studies, very few average Joes find themselves in the news. Sometimes they do, but most of the time the people that are being interviewed are elites. They're powerful people. The government, business owners, right? Those are the people that are being interviewed. So that acts as another another filter. The fourth filter is flack. Flack is when powerful people criticize the media, basically, for not doing enough to present their point of view, even though they're already getting their point of view presented plenty. So the government does this all the time. where they'll come on, some governor or mayor or the president or whatever will come on and say, well, the press is doing a really poor job. And what he's doing or what she's doing is disciplining the press so that they can get more favorable coverage in the future, according to Herman and Chomsky. And I have an analogy here. Think about a sporting event where you've got like a coach who's on the sidelines and he's complaining about a call that the referee made, right? That's flack. He knows that the referee's not going to change the call. Like, let's say the referee calls holding in a football game, and the coach complains. He says, that's not holding. He knows that the referee is not going to pick up the flag and go, oh, you know what? I changed my mind. Now that I've heard what you've said, I'm going to change my mind, and it's not holding. It has never happened, right? It never happened. It never will. But the coach still complains. Why? Because this flack is valuable to him. Because at the next close call, the referee might be less likely to throw a flag against his team. He might get more favorable calls going forward. And in basketball, they actually have a term for this. It's called the makeup call. They actually have a term for it. Referees make a call, the coach doesn't like it. The next time down the court, they'll make a call in the coach's favor to make up for it. If it was a bad call, if the original call was a bad call. So, anyways, that's flack. That's the fourth filter, and then the fifth filter is the enemy as a control mechanism. Herman and Chomsky say that there's always an enemy, communism, terrorism, whatever, that helps to control and structure the public debate about stuff. And some people have argued that the word terrorism has just become like a propaganda term. Like we shut down intellectual thought once we start talking about terrorism, because everyone's against terrorism. And so if you start making an argument and you mention terrorism, it kind of shuts down the thought. Like, for instance, they'll point out that the only time terrorism is used is when if a Muslim person nowadays in the news commits a violent act against civilians. But if another person who's not a Muslim commits an act of mass violence, then there's almost no mention of the word terrorism, right? And so people have commented, they say, well, that just is an indication that it is a propaganda term. That's actually consistent. Some people have argued that that's consistent with what Herman and Chomsky have said about the propaganda model. But the idea here is that there's always, with this fifth filter, there's always an enemy. And the enemy, the presence of an enemy, structures the public debate, right? Because as soon as you start saying, well, we have to be careful about our policy in Iraq, for instance, then people say, whoa, you're siding with the terrorists. You see what I'm saying? So that's kind of how that works sometimes. At least that's the argument that's presented by Herman and Chomsky. You don't have to agree with this. This is a very prominent argument. If you go to grad school, you'll read this book at some point probably. But I want you to grapple with it, whether you agree or disagree. But I do want you to understand the propaganda model at a basic level. I want you to understand what these 5 filters are. These are structural constraints on the news. Do you buy this? Some of you, if we had a discussion, usually we have a discussion. Some people buy it, some people don't, right? But it's something interesting for you to think about. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop again, and I'm going to finish off chapter 8 with one more, like a third part to this lesson.